All right. Does everything look good on your end?
Yeah, it looks good. Thank
Okay,
you.
cool. I just want to make sure that it all worked out. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. Like I said, my name is Tracy. I love design. I'm a bit of I do everything. My, my education background is in design. I have a degree in art and design with a concentration of graphic design from my university. But I am a developer. Like I said, I'm an entrepreneur. Have founded companies, one that didn't work out, and I'm now the program director at Tiny Seed, which is a accelerator for like SaaS businesses. Uh, and but through all of this, design is kind of the the thing that I do the most, and it's the thing that I find that design is everywhere, and design can work well with pretty much any career path. It's something that can complement any career path, and it's something that even though I'm not employed as a designer, it's something that I still use day to day. And I find people who are also employed as developers or employed as uh, business managers who are in other fields that don't aren't necessarily designers still have opportunities and still can use design to improve how they're working with their current career. So for example, like if you are an open source project developer, of course you can write your project and put it onto GitHub and have it just live there. But you know that it probably would attract more people to use your project if you have a homepage. And when you have a homepage, you have to design that homepage and you have to figure out, like here with Homebrew, you know, what are the colors going to use? What's the layout you're going to use? How are people going to use this project? Um, I mentioned some things about design. I mentioned the visual feel of things, but I want to like emphasize that design is really like how things work and how people are using it. And so, you know, whenever you're working on a project and you want to ensure that people are are using the project, that they're signing up for it, they're not having any problems like trying to access it, they're not having problems with your project in terms of like, how to use it. You know, this is where like having good documentation, having a website, having that all set up will help people use your project. And in all of that, you have to use design. You know, so there's a lot of open source projects out there that have websites, and at some point someone had to think about how these are designed and set things up, like Node, Laravel. Not just websites, design is also something you can use in presentations. So, you know, here's an example from Speaker Deck. It's a different presentation of mine. So if you're doing presentations at your work, you want to use design to make sure that it's readable, that people can glean the information from your presentation that you want them to glean. You want it to look good, look professional. Design is also, you know, your own personal website. So this is a piece of my own personal website. I also want to showcase my husband's personal website, which he is a developer, and you know, had to make design decisions on this website in terms of like how is he going to surface the links for his social media, how is he going to showcase his projects. You know, he made the design decision to add those little icons to the left of those projects where he's talking about which is a service, which is, you know, which project is a service, which project is a coding project, which project is a game. And so all of these are design decisions. And this is a part of design. But when I'm talking to people who are new to design, I know that learning design in general, learning new skills is hard. There's that feeling of the lack of confidence when you're learning a new skill that can really make it hard to pick up a new anything new. And design definitely is one of those things, like lack of confidence, not knowing what is good design, what's bad design, and whatnot, can like make it really hard to like pick up those skills. Design suffers, not really suffers, but design is particularly hard because there's no really right and wrong to design. You know, like programming, there's, you know, generally like program making, it's something's working or it's not. You know, that's kind of a generalization. Of course, there's multiple solutions to, say, any kind of programming project to get something to work. But really, it's like, it feels good because you know that something is, you know, working the way intended or not. Whereas design, it's so subjective, and there's so many different solutions to a design problem, especially when you're working on the visual design, that it can make it feel very like it's really hard to like get a good feel for what is the right decision. And I wanted to put out a lot of empathy for anyone who's picking up design, that this is absolutely like a very normal feeling. And this presentation is really to kind of help you to train your design eye and to train your kind of design intuition. So it's easier for you to, when it comes to working on designs, when you're like working on different trying to figure out what's right or wrong in a field where it's very subjective, it's very uh, up to the person. It kind of gives you a good feeling for what is the right and wrong for a design. A lot of people shy away from doing design because they know they're not this good designers, but they don't know when they do good design. And I hope that this presentation will help you kind of direct you into the right path. This, for me, I have to admit, is design is like a culmination of 25 years approximately of working on the web and in design. So it's one of those things where it's like, if you're a new designer and you're looking at me and you're like, oh, Tracy is so confident, it's because I have this 25 years of experience. And I've gotten to this point of working in the web for so long that I can intuitively feel what is good design versus not good design because I have that experience. But a lot of this presentation was born from the process of teaching myself how to code. So this is me at a presentation about 10 years ago, my last startup, which ultimately failed, which is a whole other story. But for this startup, I was a designer. I taught myself how to code in order to launch this slew of web apps that I built for Wedding Lovely. And it was during this process that I kind of had this like aha moment about learning new skills, learning new tech skills. And it's because when I say I have a background in design, I have a degree in graphic design, I actually started out going to university for computer science. And I quit out of computer science thinking I was a terrible programmer and I would never program ever, because programming was taught kind of like a theory first way. It was really taught in terms of like, let's break down sorting functions and like graph out what sorting functions are better than other sorting functions. And I was like, does not work for me. And I realized that later on, when I decided to go back to programming and be like, can I teach myself how to do this? Is that I was a little bit more project first, a little bit more like I needed to like work on something like quote unquote real as much as a web app is real as compared to working on theory. And I feel like this process also applies to design. I used that experience in programming to write my first book, which is a introduction to building web apps using Django. And it's doing that project first teaching. And then that led into, I'll talk about this book a little bit at the end, led into my latest book, which is called Hello Web Design, which is teaching design kind of using this same set of project-based principles. And so that's another thing I want to mention is that, if you've been wanting to learn design and you're reading, some traditional design books, and they aren't working for you, it could be just kind of like the way that it's being taught isn't working for the way that you think. And so this presentation and the way that I learn is more project-based rather than, say, theory-based. So how do you get yourself more comfortable with design? And I believe is that the best way to get yourself comfortable with design and become like kind of start building up that design intuition, start building up that design eye is to surround yourself with good design and then think critically about what makes it good design. And by design, I don't necessarily mean just web. This is a process you can do with almost anything because design is everywhere. Every single thing around you has been designed. So like looking around my desk, there was someone that designed the lamp that's on my desk. There was someone that designed the webcam that's on my monitor. There's someone designed the monitor itself. There's someone designed this microphone that I'm using. And so for each of these things, I can kind of look at it and kind of think about like what makes this lamp that I'm looking at, work well. Like it's a very tall lamp, it has decorative details, and kind of start thinking through, kind of like break down the decisions that that designer did for that project. And what happens to your brain is like you break down these decisions, it starts helps train your own design feelings to kind of like have an intuitive feel for what, of like good design decisions. And that's going to lead to better design decisions when you're doing your own design, when you're working on a project for yourself. So you need to train your design eye. Again, I have like 25 years of experiences of looking at things and kind of breaking it down. It's one of my favorite things to do. Um, and this is what I want all new designers to think about, not necessarily right when they're working on designing a project, but whenever they're interacting with the web, whenever they're looking at, anything that they think is like, oh, that is well designed, to think critically about what makes that thing well designed, because that's going to make you a better designer. So you can read about the theory as much as you want, the typography and color theory and rhythm and layouts and all the things that traditional design education can teach you. But you also, you need to get a feel for what's right or wrong. And it's kind of hard to explain. It's hard to explain intuition. So to talk about design intuition, how do we start? And then I know I just said like you don't have to worry about theory, but when it comes to theory, I'm going to break it down in terms design, some design like rules of thumb. So if you're starting completely from scratch, this will give you like a good starting point. We need to know what are the rules of thumb, and then when we look at other designs in a moment, how to like look at those other designs and keep in mind those rules of thumb and start seeing those rules of thumb in other designs is going to help you remember those rules of thumb later. So here are my shortcuts. So I'm not going to talk about it in terms of like, here's color theory. I'm going to just kind of talk about a little bit of shortcuts, and they all relate to some of these bigger design theory pieces like typography and color theory and layout. So when it comes to typography, my biggest thing I recommend for new designers is to avoid using a lot of different typefaces and fonts. The rules of thumb for typography is to keep the number of fonts low. I usually recommend for beginning designers to just stick with a project with 2 different typefaces, 2 different fonts. I'm going to use those interchangeably. They're not exactly the same, but we're going to use them interchangeably here. In general, try to use fancy and display fonts like those ones with big swooshes and swirls and whatnot. Use those sparingly because they're very cluttery. They can look like like cleaner fonts make things look like a little bit more professional. And if you need to have differentiation between pieces of content, you can do things like play with bolding, play with italics, and play with transforms. And you can use that to kind of make distinct areas of what you're designing. So to see what this looks like, this is my own personal website. This is not what it looks like. What I did is I went in and I changed all the fonts, and kind of this feeling of being like, this is like chaotic. There's like different, fonts going everywhere. The block quote is different. The nav is different. The header is different. The page title is different. They all have different typefaces. But you move it back down to just 2. Here, you can see that it feels cleaner. It's a little bit easier. It's a lot easier to read. It feels more professional. In limiting typefaces, like this is my paper resume. Again, just 2 different typefaces. And you can do some really nice things with just 2 typefaces. And so that's my rule of thumb when it comes to typography as a beginning designer, is to keep it to like 2 typefaces and kind of vary the way that is displayed, so you can get something that looks nice and shows everything has that like differentiation of this is a title, this is a URL, this is a subtitle, this is the description. You can do all these things just by playing with uppercase and italics and color. All right, so the second rule of thumb for design is to give your designs more space that you initially feel comfortable with. Beginning designers struggle a lot with white space. And white space, I believe, is one of the best ways to make actually a design both feel better and work better. again, going back to my website, I took out all the white space here, mushed it all together. This looks okay, but I'm a huge fan of white space. I added a lot of white space around the header because I wanted to have that emphasis on the beginning part of my website, like, that description of what I do. Added white space below. It kind of lets everything breathe and everything feels a little bit more professional. So this is a personal website, but I also wanted to showcase the New York Times. So I kind of faded out the two different versions, New York Times here, the website. And so the left is like the old version of the website. And you can kind of see like that it's pretty crammed together. And you need that for a newspaper. You don't want to have that like acres of white space like I had in my personal project. But having just a little bit more white space will make things feel a little bit cleaner and a little bit more readable. So here's a new version of the website. All they really did was there were some typography changes, but there's like a little bit more spacing in the columns. There's a little bit more spacing in between the different paragraphs of information. And you're looking at them side by side, you're going to see that the right side, just with like a little bit of addition of a little bit more space, still has all of that information they need to have above the fold, but it's a little easier to read. And white space can make a website feel a lot more professional and luxurious. So especially when you go to these luxury websites, again, acres of white space. And designers love white space. You'll see it. This is one of those like websites that collects quote unquote good design. And you can see that every single example here has tons and tons of white space. So there's like, I know that a lot of times beginner designers don't want to do something like this, like again, the acres of white space, but there is like beginning designers adding more white space than they're initially comfortable with will actually push the designs into a cleaner direction. But in terms of not just cleaner a direction, there's also like the fact that white space can make your website easier to use because the information won't be crowded together. It's going to be easier for someone at a glance to see what they need to find in your website and complete what you want them to do. So in this example, Xerox had this table information and they just added extra white space where those add to cart links are. And just by adding a little more white space, a little bit more breathing room, they saw an improvement in engagement, improvement in products out of the cart, and improvement in customers continuing on through to purchase. So, this is like the classic example of that design isn't just the way that things look. Designs can affect how people use your product. They can affect the user experience. And so like that's especially why I believe everyone should know a little bit about design and like, play with things like white space. And then one of the last rules of thumbs I want to say for beginning designers is to avoid using a lot of different colors because that kind of leads to that feeling of clutteriness, the feeling of chaoticness can be in design. And so like the rules of thumb, keep your colors complementary. And we kind of, that just means that they like a red and green are complementary colors, orange and blue are complementary colors. There's whole articles on what that means. I can't really get into here. But they kind of like, it's like a set of colors that work well together. And then I think it's a good rule of thumb for beginning designers to just think about things as neutrals and then use one brighter color for emphasis of important things. So I want to do to showcase this. This is the foundation, Zerb's foundation website. And so this is using complementary colors, using blue and orange. And it's a full color website, but the color palette is actually very limited. It is kind of just like gray, this gray neutral. And then there is parts of orange and parts of blue. So, rather than having a lot of different colors in their website, it's a very beautiful website, but it's actually very subdued when you kind of think through the colors that they're using. And I find a lot of people have I have problems trying to pick out colors to use for their website. There's a lot of different color palette websites out there that I think is a great thing to use just to get you started. So this is colormind.io. You can kind of use it to go through color palettes, and you can kind of start here and start designing your project using these color palettes that are generated. And then that you are working with a limited set of colors rather than say like jumping into a color palette in some design program and having, millions of colors to choose from and not knowing where to start. I think it's much easier. And this is what I do as a professional designer, is to start from a color palette, especially from one of these generator websites, and use that to give yourself a starting point. And then I think this is the last one, is to try to line things up. So I'm going to take all these principles, by the way, and we're going to apply them. We're going to use that to train our design eye. But again, I'm just kind of going through some of these things to look for when we're training our design eye. Lining things up is something that will help. Having like an invisible skeleton to your design is going to help things feel, again, less chaotic and more professionally designed. An underlying grid gives a feeling of cohesiveness to a design. So this is something from Medium. I took it and I kind of moved things around and kind of this feeling of just like, a child made this. There's things everywhere. Nothing is aligned up. Everything feels a little bit chaotic. But then when you move it, so everything is on a like left aligned and everything is like lined up together. This is actually pretty easy. If you're using a design framework, a CSS framework, like say Bootstrap or Tailwind or whatnot, and they have this like grid system built in, this makes front-end development and designing websites very easy. This is something that you do want to pay attention to if you're like, say, designing slides. Because those things don't have necessarily a framework built in. So if you're using something like Keynote where you can put something anywhere, just knowing that lining up everything into one, like say vertical column, will make your design feel a little more professional, a little more clean. So all these principles, all this kind of shortcuts actually came directly from my book. I don't want to give too much of a shout out to my book, but it's called Hello Web Design. It kind of goes through all these basic design principles and these shortcuts you can use. And it all ties into this one single concept if you're going to remember one thing as a beginning designer and you're trying to train your design eye, is to reduce visual clutter, and will make you a better designer. And you can reduce visual clutter by keeping the number of fonts and colors low, adding white space, and lining things up. So in general, aim for a clean design. Professional designers, people who've been doing this for a while, can break all these rules because they have that design intuition already built in. But before you've built that design intuition, that confidence in design, these are good rules of thumb to follow. And these are good rules of thumb to look at as you're looking at good design. And that's the next more important section. So now you have this like baseline of good design principles. The way that you pick up better confidence in your design skills, ignoring practice and working on your design first, because this is much faster, is to just simply nitpick good design. Any design that's out there, nitpick everything that you see around you. But if you're trying to get better at web design, of course, nitpick every single piece of good design that you see on the web, and try to figure out what they're doing well and what you can be inspired from. So how do you find good design? That's also a question I often get. Because if you're a beginning designer, you don't have a good design intuition, you don't know what designs are good. One place you can go, a good shortcut is, there's a lot of websites that just simply link out to other good designed websites. So there's things like Site Inspire. There's a few other like these collection websites. So that's a good place to start going. The websites on these showcase websites are going to be more of like, say, avant-garde. They're going to be things that are kind of like pushing the field of design. It'll give you a good idea of where things are going. What are the design things that people are playing with, but it might be a little bit advanced. But when you go here and you can kind of see how people are working with colors, how people are working with white space, how people are working with typography, and that'll help you kind of see, that every site that's on here are like quote unquote considered good design. And so you can use this as a starting point for starting your nitpicks. But I also like looking at things like Dribble. Dribble with 3 Bs is just a place for designers to showcase like images and designs that they've done they're particularly proud about. And so you can search for things like logins and see how people have designed, say, different login pages. And then here is a place where you can go and look at these logins, get a feel for what are some really nice inspiring login pages and kind of start this process of nitpicking, which I'll get into in a second. And awards is another showcase website that also goes through good, like what people consider are good designs. So when you have this platform, this foundation of design ideas of reducing clutter and adding white space and kind of like picking out these good, ways to like determine what's a good decision. And then you have this area of these websites to look at. And again, you don't have to go on these websites. Anytime you're on a website, if you're just browsing the internet, someone links something to you and you have this like feeling of being like, ooh, this website is cool. I like this website. This is where you can start nitpicking and start picking out those good decisions. And you think critically about whatever this design is doing. And you're like, this login page looks great. This button is awesome. And you kind of figure out why. Why is this button awesome? Is it the placement of the button? Is it the colors of the button? Is it the text on top of the button? And the more things you can pick out, the better you're going to train your design intuition. So basically think critically about what makes a design work well. And I'll kind of go into this in a second. I'm going to see if I can switch out of Keynote and move on to the browser here. So I think you can see the browser. This is the GitHub website. And so say you're browsing the web and you come on to GitHub website and you're like, hey, this website looks great. What makes it work? Like, what are the things that you like about it? What are the decisions that the designers put into github.com that make it a good, well-working website? Like, what can we learn from this? So, for example, I would say that if you're thinking about colors, you're thinking about, keeping a fairly neutral palette and then one single color to like, for emphasis. You can see here the GitHub website is largely one color. There's like this deep blue, this deep purple, and they use this bright green, this bright contrasting color for their button. So you can say, boom, they have a bright contrasting color for their button because that button's the most important part of the page. They want to draw the eye to that button. They want people to put in their email address and sign up for GitHub. Other design decisions, this doesn't look like the acres of white space, but if you look at it, there actually is a lot of white space here. There's a lot of white space above the headline. There's a lot of white space below this form here. There's a lot of white space to the right. This globe is spinning, but there's no text or information here. And so it still kind of serves as white space. So this is like a really good example of like where there's a lot of white space. There's not a lot of content on this above the fold, but it feels balanced. It doesn't feel empty. Other design decisions that are making, the navigation has these really nice drop downs. You can see that they put an arrow here, so you know that these ones are going to be popping up a drop down. So that was a design decision of bringing that arrow in. They have two buttons on the right side, but sign up has a border around it, whereas sign in doesn't. And that's because, you can kind of theorize that sign in doesn't have a border on it because people who are signing in have been here before. They know where it is. They know to click on it. But the sign up button is for people who've never been here before. So you want to emphasize it more. You want to make it easier to find. So they added a border here to make that easier. And then they have a search bar right at the top, because I know people are going to be using GitHub to search and find for different open source projects. We're going to scroll down a little bit. This illustration is awesome. These illustrations are hard for new designers, but you can kind of see adding this illustration here makes GitHub look like you can tell they put a lot of effort into it if they have a full-on beautiful illustration in. And as we scroll, we can pick out other things like they, instead of this box being static, it kind of popped in. That's kind of a neat little way of drawing the eye to that box. They have the buttons are very similar between sign up. They have the same single border and rounded edges. They've continued that feel with a single border and rounded edges. And then also this box has a 1 pixel border and rounded edges. So they kind of have this like repetition of elements. So you kind of get what I'm talking about. Like when you're going through a website, when a website looks good like this, what are those decisions they're making? And so if you're thinking to yourself, these are the decisions they're making, these are the things I can pick out from this website. Even if you're not implementing this, even if you're not like directly carrying over those decisions into a current design, if you're just practicing this act of nitpicking design and picking out those good design decisions, then you're going to become a better designer later. You're going to train your design intuition, and you're going to have built up a little bit more confidence in terms of what design things you can use in your, what design skills you can use in your own designs, and like this confidence of knowing that your design looks good. So I wanted to, this is GitHub. Just all sorts of things going on here. A lot of things that might be, this is a very well-designed website that might be out of reach to some people. I wanted to move over to SavvyCal. So SavvyCal is designed by a tiny seed portfolio company. And Derek Reimer is a developer, but he's also a very, really good designer. And this is his website. So some of the design decisions that he made here, it is a simpler website than GitHub. It is a website that's designed not necessarily for developers, but I want to say for tech people. So it's a little less flashy because it is just a very small team, and this might be a little bit more accessible to a typical designer. Some of the things he did, he has a highlight on this. I'm actually going to start out with the whole headline. The headline is big. It's eye-catching. It's very simple. It kind of in the phrasing of it, sending your scheduling link shouldn't feel weird. When you say shouldn't feel weird, that is not something you usually see as a headline of a page. And so you can kind of say like, oh, because you don't usually see it, because it's like a little bit more human, it catches the eye and kind of like gets people interested more so than say a more boring headline. So you can kind of pick out, okay, Derek has really worked on this headline here. He's really like wanted to like capture people right at the very beginning with this very big headline. And then he emphasized the weirdest part, so to say, with this highlight, with this little design highlight. And the design highlight is a little bit angled. So it doesn't look like CSS. It looks a little bit more interesting than just say like a typical background image or background color on CSS. So he put in some little design features here by like highlighting and angling here. It is also, we're talking about colors. It's a very, it's not a very colorful website, but it is black. It has highlights of yellow, lots of highlights of yellow, the contrasting color of blue for his button. And so the blue is shouldn't feel weird and getting started are the two things you see first. The other two links here up in the top right, pricing and sign in, are less emphasized. That's because he wants people to see these two things first. And he's done other things, other design decisions here by using this bright yellow background, which contrasts with this interactive demo that he has here, which draws the eye more. It brings emphasis to this area that's really important. He's making good decisions in terms of typography. The type is really simple. Hey, look, there's me. These things are angled a little bit. That also like lends this like little like, ooh, that's interesting feeling to it. That kind of makes the design itself feel these like little design decisions that are, that as a user are less typical, I think brings a design. If this person put effort here, and because they put effort into their design, you kind of this feeling that they put effort into the product itself. Really big type here, lots of white space. It's funny when I was saying things lined up because he made the decision of, angling these boxes. You would argue that things aren't typically lined up, but you can kind of tell before it was angled, it was left aligned with this box here. Everything is actually into a grid. Let's see if there's anything else I can pick out here that's different. Again, I want to point out this white space here. I want to point out the big type, like how easy it is to read this, how great that is. So again, say you landed on Derek's website of SavvyCal and you're like, hey, this website looks great. And you pick out, oh, this is probably why he did this. This is probably why he made, he's using this yellow background. He changed it so it's yellow highlights. when you pick out these decisions, it's going to help train your intuition. It's going to help you become a better designer. And it's just like, it's constant, easy work, but I think it's really important and something that will become more natural as you get better at looking at designs and like picking out those decisions. And I wanted to do one more example. I'll do this one a lot quicker because I know we're spending a lot of time here. In terms of Designer Fund, so Designer Fund is it's a investment firm around design companies. So obviously they're very into design. And I wanted to give this as an example of a very complicated website with a lot of complicated decisions. So I wanted to bring it up because like a lot of decisions making here might be out of reach for like a typical beginner designer. They've done a lot of cool things where they like took the headline and they put it off, to the side and they made it sideways. And so it's like, you're like, ooh, that is very designery. They have actually more fonts than I say that just that two. There's like a serif font here. There's a sans serif font here. There's a headline font here. These things are repeated throughout. They don't have actually a lot of, there's like one more right here. But it's like one of those kind of things where I said like if really excellent designers can start breaking some of these beginner rules, and Designer Fund has definitely done that, but in a very, very beautiful way. So like I just wanted to bring it up here as this is another place where you can kind of see what the advanced things you can do as a designer, but don't feel bad if you feel like this is a little too overwhelming, is a little bit too designed to be really nitpicked about as a beginning designer. But it's fun to look at. It's fun to see. Whoops, I didn't mean to click that. It's fun to see. There we go. Some of the interactions they put on their website, and use that to inspire you as you do your own website. And here's another example of what they could do with just type that looks really beautiful. They didn't have to use images for this, but they used CSS as you do these hovers to like bring in that colored underline and change how the topic switches to an arrow so you can click on this. So that's an example of a very beautiful website that you can use to nitpick, but there's a lot of big decisions there. I think these websites more like SavvyCal are a little bit easier as you're working on your training your design eye. So I'm going to switch back over to Keynote. I put in GitHub's previous design here too, because I also find it interesting to see how they evolved, where this is their old GitHub design. It was more gray. They still have that bright green emphasis in the button. You kind of see how they've like changed there's even nitpicking design decisions here because they can see that they changed their headline from built to developers to where the world builds software. So you can see that they opened up the type of people they're targeting when they did this redesign, which I find really fascinating. So even decisions like that also to think about like, why did GitHub change their headline? Why did they make that decision? Is also an interesting thought process. Now, you can also pick out the bad decisions, but this is something I think as a beginning designer, it's harder to see the bad decisions than the good. And so that's why I like to say, like, go through all the things that you know are good design, or you see, when I say good design, it's how do you choose this good design? And the reason why I pick up GitHub is pretty much any tech company that has a large design team, you can assume that they have the design decisions they made have been intentional. But it's also useful. When you're using a project and when you're using a website and you're like, I don't like the way that looks. I don't like that, the way that interaction worked. I don't like how that login page worked. It's also useful to think about why it didn't work for you. Was it the headline? Was it hard to read? Was it hard to understand? And that also is a useful process. I find it's better to pick out the good decisions and really get a good feel for what are good decisions you can make. But picking out the bad decisions is also something that you can is a good process, especially when you're faced with things like this, which is GoDaddy does not look like this anymore. But when we talk about those design principles of fewer fonts, fewer colors, more white space, line things up, you can see that the GoDaddy website here is breaking all of those decisions. They have billions of colors and billions of fonts and lining up. Things are just everywhere. And you can kind of see how that kind of contributes to this very chaotic design. And we went over GitHub already. And I want to say is like, this is kind of like a design mental process, but it's, this is also something you want to bring forward for when you're working on your own design. So you can say like, you're working on your own design, you have to design a login page. You should go out and be inspired by their login page. Don't start from scratch. But you don't want to copy exactly. So this, I grabbed this from GitHub, and this is a, sorry, not GitHub, excuse me, Dribbble. I grabbed this from Dribbble. This is someone's mock-up of a login form. And so you can be inspired by the decisions that are made here. You can look at this and you say, okay, there's only two colors. I guess gray is a color, but it's like red, black, and gray they're used in design. So they have few colors. There's only one font. They have everything lined up in this form. The form is full width. So the right side of the form is actually lined up with that sign in button below. There is a lot of white space. So there's create account at the top has a good amount of white space below the headline, and then those social buttons have a good amount of white space below them, and then there's the form there. So everything has that open feeling. And you might notice around the form there's a significant white space to the left and right. So you can pick out those good decisions. You can tell yourself, you can bring those good decisions to the thing that to that login form you're designing. You don't want to copy it verbatim. Make enough changes to it that you're taking the idea, but you're not taking the design. And I don't think you should ever start from scratch. Is a big thing that designers, like, there's this quote, which I don't know if this is actually Pablo Picasso's quote, but it's like, all artists copy, great artists steal. Like, I know that for any design project that I do, I never start from scratch. Bansky also kind of did a riff on that, saying the bad artists imitate, the great artists steal. There's a bunch of books on artists, steal like an artist. Any design work is going to be inspired by other design work, but it's just whether you can make enough, like, you can steal the idea and steal the good decisions with it without stealing the design itself verbatim. Lots of articles about it as well. Definitely use inspiration, because inspiration and training, inspiration is important for training your design eye, as well as when you're working on a design. So, trying to sit down and work on a new design from scratch without using any sort of inspiration is a lot like trying to work on a new programming project without the use of Stack Overflow, or like, being able to Google for solutions. It just won't happen. You need to, when programming, you pretty much need to have documentation and examples and Googling and whatnot at your hand. And that's the same thing with inspiration. When you're working on login forms, you're working on an onboarding, you're working on a new website, you need to look at other things to be inspired, that you can use to implement in your process. This is something that I did in my first book, Hello Web App. You can see that I was once you look at these books side by side, you can see that I was inspired by A Book Apart. I like their use of bright colors. I like their use of bold typography, like really big type at the front. I like their use of white space. I like the use of simplicity. They don't have like an image on here. There's not a lot of gradients or anything like that. But Hello Web App is the distinct design from A Book Apart. So I did not copy their design, but you can definitely see that I was inspired by it. And then the thing that's hard is that you need to continually practice, always practice. Because, your first design is never going to be amazing. Your second design is going to be a little bit better than your first design. Your third design is going to be a little bit better than your second design. And it is totally okay to work on training your design eye and look at inspiration, and feel like you're kind of like have mittens on when you're trying to design yourself. It's just because you need to practice. And every design, to a professional designer like myself, to anyone else, is going to start off feeling like a disaster. This is my thought process every single time I do design. And again, I've been kind of working on the web for like 25 years, where it just starts off, I start designing and it's like, it feels awful and it's not working and like that looks ugly and I don't like it. There's like this moment of like, okay, going out, looking inspiration. Maybe I'll add this idea. Maybe I'll add this other like this way that someone else is doing it. Maybe I'll implement that in my own design and see how that works. There's this point where you just keep poking at it and it's all of a sudden it's maybe not like a yes, but maybe it's like a maybe, or maybe it's like something like you're getting closer to a good design. But it's always going to start off feeling a little bit like a disaster. I know I've talked to other designers, like professional designers, it's the same for them. So, as you're training your design eye, as you're implementing those designs yourself, if you start off kind of working on a new design and you're like, this is a disaster, that does not mean you're a bad designer. It means that you're simply a designer. You're working on the process of being a designer. It's just like programming where you have to, programming surfaces up bugs and errors, and you're constantly trying to like go through and fix error by error by error into the certain point that the programming project is working. It's the same thing with design, but the errors are that feeling of like, this isn't working. These colors are clashing. This doesn't look good. And you'll have a better feel for those decisions by training your design eye. Every design you do is going to be better than the last. It might be a little bit better. It might be a lot better. It depends on the person, but every design you do, you're going to learn from it and you're going to be better than the last one. So it's the process of iteration. It's a process of looking at design, of thinking critically about design, but also making sure that you are trying to design things, even if it's just presentations. Every presentation you do on a certain topic, maybe then that you keep iterating on your slide design and try to make them look a little bit better and use as a process to teach yourself design. It's just like, it's like everything, it's like programming. It's like learning how to pitch baseball. You can watch someone throwing the ball, and kind of, nitpick what they're doing right. You can see that they're turning their body in a certain way, that they're using the movement of their body, not just their arms, to throw the ball. But it still takes you getting out there and throwing the ball yourself. You might, train your intuition about what works and what not. You also need to train the physicality, train your body to do it. So in essence, I want you, if you want to train your design eye, to start thinking critically about design starting today. So anytime you see a good website, spend 30 seconds to look at the decisions that they're making and kind of pick out what they're doing right. And you can use that foundation of design, of knowing generally to line things up, generally to add more white space, generally reduce the number of colors you're using, and generally to reduce the number of fonts. You can kind of take that foundation and look at these designs and kind of pick out how those websites are using those principles. And what you're going to do is you're going to start training your design intuition. It's going to make it easier for you to do designs yourself. Think about why something is successful. Why is something not successful? And then practice. Don't be afraid to iterate. You're going to make a better design. You're working on a certain design, take a break, come back in there a day, apply those critical thinking skills, use that foundation, and improve those designs and continue to iterate on the same design, continue to iterate and doing new designs. Just keep working at it. And try to have fun. I like design. I mean, it's one of those kind of things where it's going to be really scary to begin with. It's going to be really that feeling of not having a lot of confidence is going to be there. If you break through it, I feel like having a foundation of design will help anyone in any career path that they're working, whether programmer, CEO, marketer, anything. These foundations of design skills is going to help you improve your current career. So, like I mentioned earlier, I go into this more in my book. This is Hello Design. This version right here is actually my first edition, is the one that I self-published, but I sold it to a publisher, which is actually really cool that a publisher said, hey, that book is doing well. We would like to put it through our publishing house. So it's going to be re-released through No Starch Press this summer. If you go to nostarch.com/hello-web-design, you can pre-order the book, and it should be coming out in June. I don't think there's an exact date yet, but I I know that the copies are printed. They're going to be hardcover as compared to this version, which is a soft cover. They're going to look really nice, and it's going to be coming out in June, and it goes into this design stuff in general. And then, like I said, I also work at Tiny Seed. Tiny Seed is a accelerator designed for SaaS bootstrappers. So if you're a programmer, entrepreneur, or anything like that, working on a SaaS project, check out Tiny Seed if you haven't heard of us before. Kind of giving a different path for funding outside the typical venture-backed VC track. And that's it. Please chat with me online. I'll be here for questions. But I am Tracy Makes nearly anywhere on Twitter, whatnot. So if you have any questions, I'll put the slides up later. You can find me on the internet as Tracy Makes. All right. Thank you. I'm going to break out of here.
Thanks so much, Tracy. There were so many great pieces of actionable advice, and that's what I really love in a talk, something that I can actually take away and do.
I really work on that. I feel like takeaways are very important for a talk, and I've been to many talks in my life, my time, that have never had takeaways. So I'm glad to hear you say that.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. I've made a lot of notes, so I should be going back, because I think what you say is true, that you really want to make a great design, and you look at all these websites and you think, I can never do that. But what's missing is that you don't think about why they're good. So I think that's my main takeaway from your talk today, is look at it with a critical eye and think about why it's good, what you like about it.
Yeah, it's always fun being a critique, right? Or criticizing things. I think that's a human nature that people forget that they can use that as a skill, this idea of criticizing.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got quite a few questions. I'm going to ask my question first, because it's the highest prerogative.
Yeah.
So you put, I think it was Design Fund that you showed us the website of. And I noticed that the title was rotated by 90 degrees clockwise, wasn't it? I think it was something like, I can't remember what it said, but it was this way around.
Yeah, but they use like the subtitles of the page. They rotated them to kind of like add a little more visual interest to it. They're like that. Those are those kind of things that like give a user of a website that's like, ooh, they like the ooh to it. It's a little less readable because it's on the side, but they did it because they're like, oh, we're designers. This is interesting. This is different.
So my question about that is accessibility. So what about folks who use screen readers and things like that? Does it pick it up? Because obviously you want to make sure your designs are inclusive, right?
I don't know exactly how Design Fund implemented it. I'm sure it's accessible because I know that they care about that. In the underlying HTML, of course, it's still horizontal. So as a screen reader goes through it, I'm sure the screen reader can still read it. So I think it's just a visual feel that it's turned. But that is a good point. That is something I want to say that's more on the advanced side of design is thinking about design. Really actually comes down to how people are using your website and how well they can use your website. And a piece of the population that you need to keep in mind of are people who can't use computers the way we do. They might not be able to use a mouse. They might not be able to use a keyboard. They might not be able, might be blind. They might not have a screen. And so, you can keep in mind screen readers. In general, if your HTML is formatted correctly, screen readers can handle it. And then that's one of the things where you want to make sure your HTML is great. And then all those design things you put into CSS and design only ways of displaying. But I personally am not that's not my specialty. I know there's other people who are specialists in accessible design, but it's something to keep in mind. It's just keep your HTML clean, mess with the design via CSS, and then screen readers can handle it.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of things we can take from you, and also maybe go and look at some accessibility tips and combine them together. So we did have a lot of lively chat when you talked about white space, and there was somebody in there who had worked for a newspaper, and that newspaper was obsessed with filling every piece of real estate with adverts and things for people to click on and spend their money. So somebody has asked, and they definitely see the merit of white space, but they're not a fan of large sections of it at the side. So what's your take on it from a design point of view? Is it a rule of thumb in design, because they feel like it seems to take away from the design possibilities of the body content?
So in general, without having design to look at, in general, white space is going to, in general, you want to think about what your website needs to achieve. So for a typical SaaS application, you probably want someone to read the features, understand what's going on, get an idea for what the project is doing, and you want them to sign up. So especially for things like adding in what the company, what that SaaS app is doing with those features, when there's a lot of text on a page, again, I'm talking in general, but there's a lot of text on the page, you're trying to like fill in all of those features and everything that they do and everything that like long paragraphs and whatnot, like too much content can be hard. That's like not good for usability. It's not good for user experience because the typical person sees those giant paragraphs of content and they just skip it. And so there's things about white space is also kind of like cutting your content down and making it easier to read. So you cut your content down, make it easier to read, easier to understand. That improves the usability of your usability, readability, user experience of reading those features. And then white space also allows the page people to see those features, to kind of land on it as an eye rather than glazing over it as a whole. Again, it's kind of I want to go back to like SavvyCal because SavvyCal has a lot of white space on there. And I think that's a good example of each piece of information is concise and has white space around it. So your eye can go like, boom, there's that one. There's that one. There's that one. They don't blur together. And so that's what white space can do is you separate those pieces of information easier to read. And then it's not necessarily wasted space because it's actually more usable. It's more readable. So, sometimes designers can't, I agree. There's some places where designers go a little overboard. I actually took out some slides out of this, which I kind of regret doing, where like there's Hacker News. A lot of people know Hacker News is news.ycombinator.com, where everything is kind of close together. And I'll see people being like, ooh, I redesigned Hacker News. I made it better. And like almost always, they just added more white space. I would argue that Hacker News is very usable as it is. It doesn't need any more white space. Designers love white space. They're always going to add white space. And there's places where you could add too much. And what I want to say is like, instead of looking at it as like kind of wasted space, or maybe you can add more information there, kind of look at how well the website is doing. Are people able to see your features? Are you able to read it? Are they able to understand what's going on? It might require a usability test, sitting down with someone and seeing them use your website and seeing if they can read those things. And white space is that tool you can use to improve how well people can use it. So that's the best way for me to explain it. Maybe white space on the left and right side of the things makes a sentence shorter. Like maybe it wraps to more lines, because if a sentence has too many words in one line, it's actually unreadable. And that's kind of, I don't want to pitch my book, but I have to pitch my book because I have a whole section on this about like readability for content and how that applies to design. But white space is something you can use as a technique for that.
Yeah, definitely. So we do have a few more questions, but I want to respect your time as well. So maybe we'll just...
I'm fine. If you want to do lightning round, I can try to go faster.
Okay, well, this might be a quick one. Can you recommend any courses for beginner designers?
Use my book. Read my book. It's great.
I walked straight into that.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I wrote the book, right? So like longer story, a little bit longer, is that I find a lot of beginning design courses will, again, go into the theory. They kind of assume that you're becoming a full-fledged designer. So they go theory first. And I find that doesn't really work for someone who's using it to complement their current skills, which is why I wrote my book. Smashing Magazine has a few articles. I think they have one that's like the Web Developer's Guide to Color. There are articles aimed at people who are like developers wanting to learn design principles without learning the whole thing. So Smashing Magazine is also, I think, a good resource for that.
Yeah, and it's very usable for beginners, the way that, because they curate all their articles very well, don't they? So they make sure that they're very usable for the target audience as well. So we've got somebody here saying they've got an artistic mind, but translating this to the web is difficult for them. Do you have a recommendation for how to translate artistic mentality into the web in the vein of better design sites? And I think what they're trying to get at there is that artisticness doesn't necessarily mean the same as good design. Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily mean the same as good web design. So I think what they're trying to say is how can they harness these skills that they've got and translate that into to better design sites.
Yeah. So there's like a difference between visual design, which I think a very artistic person is probably very good at visual design. And then there's user experience, which is the other half of design when it comes to the web. Knowing that, if you want to create like a login page, it's not just how the login page looks, but you also want to make sure people can fill out that login page. So there's a few books out there to help with user experience. So look up things in general for user experience. You can do that same like critical thought process for user experience as well. What is that login flow? Why does that work well? Why did I feel comfortable signing up for this new website? Why did I was fine with clicking and sign up for this website immediately without being like, oh, why should I do this? Like, why did that website make me feel comfortable enough to do that? Those are kind of like user experience things you can kind of pick out. There's a book called Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug that talks specifically about user experience and usability that I think will help a visual designer become better at thinking about the processes of designing for the web in terms of user experience.
Yeah, definitely. I like the way that you kind of pointed out there that design and user experience are kind of two sides of the same coin almost, aren't they? Which leads into the next question. So this person is scared, and I think a lot of us have this fear. They're scared that their taste may actually suck. So they're looking at this website thinking, it's brilliant, it's lovely, it's my favourite website ever, and it's the GoDaddy website from like 2006. So how do they know if what they like is actually good design and not just them picking out like the worst design aspects ever because that's what their brain liked? And how do they develop good taste?
So good taste, again, like that's where going to places where you know that the crowd, if you're like, you want to like design for the crowd, there's something to be said about designing for yourself, and you have a certain aesthetic that you love and you're designing for yourself, and that is totally okay. And I want you to develop that. But when you're designing for other things for other people to use, it's useful to know what the masses of people prefer. And that's where going to those design collection websites like Awards with 3 W's and Site Inspire and Dribble, you can see what people in general consider good design. So you ignore your own design preferences. You can see what the masses of people prefer as good design, and you can kind of pick out what people prefer from that and help inform yourself. And so you know that you can make designs again for those masses. It's like step 1 is to design like other people, and like step maybe 10 is to then figure out your own aesthetic. You can apply those your preferences and use that to become a better designer with your own. Applying those like the things that you prefer, but also knowing that you're designing for other people, you're designing for the masses, and you know that you want to make things that most people find beautiful. You can combine those two, but to kind of train yourself and learning what other people find beautiful, usable, workable, good experiences, that's when you can look at major, like any kind of website that has like a design team behind it, like GitHub. Then you can pick out those decisions from there and kind of like apply that to your own aesthetic and combine them to create your own, like to kind of build up, I say, better taste. And I say better taste, again, design is great. Everyone has their own aesthetic. Instead of saying good taste, maybe just like designing for the masses, because you know you want your thing to be used by most people.
That's true, because the masses don't necessarily have taste, do they?
Like people in general like these things. People don't like following trends. I think following trends as a new designer is great, because again, that's step 1. Just follow what other people are doing, be inspired from it, use that to take a shortcut to become a better designer. And when you practice more and you iterate more and you build up your design confidence, then you can kind of break out of that mold and do your own thing. But you kind of need to do what everyone else is doing at first.
Yeah, it definitely relates back to the final point that you made in your talk about just going out there and practicing and iterating and just getting incrementally better each time. So you talked about the fact that you have got, I want to say quarter of a century, because that sounds really grand, doesn't it? You've got over 25 years of experience.
I started making websites when I was 12, and it was HTML framed websites. So I say technically.
Well, no, it's all good, isn't it? We all start by right-clicking and viewing source and doing it that way, don't we? But so you talked about how, looking at people's websites, figuring out what you think works, what would work for your particular audience. Have you ever spoken to the decision makers behind these sites and picked their brains on how they arrived at their designs?
It's a good question. I think I have not. Mainly because I think that would be a really fun process. I've never thought to do it though. I think it's just because I'm an anxious. I actually have a lot of social anxiety, and so like if you're at a conference though, and you find someone who's a designer at this thing, could be a really great way to like start a conversation with them. Like, hey, can you tell me about these design decisions you made? Can you talk to me about this? Like, why did you do that decision? Like, is there data or was that just a guess? Like I can be a really good process. Personally, have not done it that much. Actually with Derek, I talked to him a little bit about that because he's a part of Tiny Seed, and I'm using SavvyCal as an example. So I have, anyone, designer, I think that'd be a really good process. I would say like finding a designer who works on like a big tech project like GitHub. Those are huge teams. Designers are probably working on small little things. But yeah, it definitely is useful to talk to designers, see their thought process and whatnot. It just might be more efficient to kind of like think critically about like websites yourself as well. So use those two things in tandem.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you do ever meet a designer that whose work you really admire, definitely ask them. I think the answer would be quite revealing, because they might say, well, I saw this other design, I just kind of took inspiration from that.
They talk about fine artists where there's like, or I guess I've seen it with books where someone says like, a critiquer is looking at a book and they're like, oh, they mentioned this thing because that's a metaphor for this other thing and blah, 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 blah. And then you talk to the author and the author is just like, I just wanted that thing in there. Like there was no decision there. So you could read into it, but it's still like, again, if you're the designer doesn't necessarily like think about that login process and that button color, they didn't like have the thing that you picked out of it, but you still learn from that. You still kind of picked out a good decision. Doesn't necessarily mean that the designer, like because they didn't think of it ahead of time, doesn't mean that it's not still a good design decision. It's still something that you're learning from the design that maybe necessarily came as an accident.
Yeah, I'm going to wind up in a moment because we have gone a little bit over time. But what you just said to me reminded me of something, and I'm digressing fully here, so Brian's probably going to kill me afterwards. But yeah, sorry, Brian. It's a good example. So the poet Ted Hughes, the very famous poet Ted Hughes, who was married to Sylvia Plath, they had some children, and his daughter went to school, and they were studying Ted Hughes's poem, because like everyone studies Ted Hughes at school, don't they? And she came home and said, this is what you meant when you did this poem. He was like, no, it wasn't. It was nothing like that. So yes, you can definitely interpret an artist's work, but it's not necessarily what they meant at the time. And there are no new ideas after all, are they? So you mentioned that your book is going to be published again in hard copy in June. So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
For that. I was just wondering, folks are very keen to get hold of it now. Is the ebook still available at the moment, or did I have to wait?
It is not, because it's been it's there. The content is largely the same, but there is some changes. So it's still the same pre-order link with no search, and that's just next month. So the pre-order won't be that long. I think they have an ebook version too. So it's like paper. It's like hardcover and ebook and whatnot. And feel free to send me a message if you have any issues with No Search's website, and I can bug them myself.
Cool. Yeah, you say June and it feels really far away, but actually that's
I know.
like next week, isn't it?
Insanity.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you so much, Tracy, for joining us today and giving up your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.